The pastel pink balloons bobbed against the ceiling of Jessica's living room like accusations, each one a reminder of the baby shower I had paid for, organized, and was now desperately trying to escape from, as my sister's voice cut through the cheerful chatter with the precision of a blade designed specifically to wound me in front of 30 witnesses. "You're going to help with this one too, right, Emma?" Jessica had called out from her throne-like position in the center of the room, one hand resting on her swollen belly, while the other gestured toward me with the casual ownership of someone who had never questioned her right to my time, money, and unwavering sacrifice. "I mean, you've been such an amazing aunt to all my babies. I honestly don't know what I would have done without you paying for cribs, diapers, formula, and even helping with rent when things got tight." The room had erupted in approving laughter and knowing smiles. 30 women who had watched this performance 4 times before and had come to view my financial support of Jessica's expanding family as both admirable sisterly devotion and amusing evidence of my permanent spinsterhood. To them, I was the reliable aunt who had found her purpose in enabling someone else's motherhood, since I had apparently failed to achieve my own. "Emma's been a godsend," chimed in our cousin Michelle, raising her mimosa in a toast that felt like a funeral ceremony for my dignity. "Jessica, you're so lucky to have a sister who steps up like that. Not everyone would sacrifice their own life to make sure their nieces and nephews have everything they need. Sacrifice my own life." The phrase hung in the air like an indictment, perfectly summarizing the reality that everyone in this room acknowledged, but no one questioned. At 34, I had no husband because I couldn't afford to date when every spare dollar went to Jessica's children. I had no children of my own because I was too busy raising hers. I had no savings, no retirement plan, no vacation memories, and no dreams that hadn't been deferred indefinitely to fund my sister's reproductive choices. "Oh, Emma will definitely help," Jessica had continued with the confident smile of someone who had never been told no by the person whose bank account she treated as her personal trust fund. "She's already promised to cover the hospital bills since this pregnancy wasn't exactly planned, and I know she'll want to make sure baby number 5 has the same beautiful nursery as all the others. Hospital bills." The words hit me like ice water because I had never promised any such thing, though Jessica's assumption that I would cover her medical expenses was apparently so automatic that she felt comfortable announcing my financial commitment to a room full of people before bothering to ask if I was willing or able to provide $20,000 for her latest unplanned pregnancy. "How wonderful," murmured Mrs. Patterson from down the street, her voice carrying the kind of patronizing approval that older women use when praising younger women for making appropriately selfless choices. "Emma, you must feel so fulfilled knowing that you're making such a difference in these children's lives. Not everyone is called to motherhood directly. Some of us are called to support others who are blessed with that gift. Called to support others." As if my decade of financial servitude to Jessica's maternal ambitions was some kind of spiritual vocation, rather than the result of emotional manipulation, family pressure, and my own inability to establish boundaries with people who viewed my resources as community property. I looked around the room at faces that had watched me work double shifts to buy birthday presents for Jessica's children, while she stayed home collecting government assistance. Faces that had seen me miss family vacations because I was babysitting while Jessica went on weekend getaways with whatever man had fathered her latest pregnancy. Faces that had observed me grow thinner, grayer, more tired with each year of subsidizing someone else's choices while my own life withered from neglect. "Emma?" Jessica's voice carried a note of impatience as she waited for my enthusiastic agreement to fund her 5th child's needs. "You're being awfully quiet over there. I hope you're not having second thoughts about helping your family." Helping your family. The manipulation was so practiced, so automatic, that Jessica delivered it without conscious thought. The implication that refusing to bankrupt myself for her benefit would constitute abandoning my family obligations, rather than establishing healthy boundaries with someone who had been exploiting my generosity for over a decade. Something inside my chest cracked like ice under pressure, a sound so loud in my own ears that I was surprised no one else seemed to hear it. 10 years of swallowed protests, suppressed resentment, and self-sacrifice that had been praised as virtue finally crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity about what I had allowed to happen to my life. I stood up from my chair in the corner, the chair I had been relegated to despite organizing and paying for this celebration, and felt the room's attention focus on me with the kind of anticipatory energy that suggested everyone could sense something significant was about to happen. "Jessica," I said, my voice carrying more strength than I had felt in years, "we need to talk." The laughter died instantly as 30 women recognized the tone of someone who had finally reached the end of their patience with being treated as a resource rather than a person. The pattern that would define the next decade of my life had started innocuously enough with Jessica's first pregnancy at 19, when she called me crying from her college dorm room because the pregnancy test was positive and she had no idea how she was going to afford diapers, formula, or the medical expenses that her student insurance wouldn't cover completely. "Emma, I'm so scared," she had sobbed through the phone, her voice carrying the kind of genuine vulnerability that had always been my weakness when it came to my younger sister. "Mom and Dad are going to kill me, and Marcus already said he's not ready to be a father. I don't know what I'm going to do." Marcus was Jessica's college boyfriend, a pre-med student whose immediate disappearance from her life had surprised no one who had been paying attention to his character during the 6 months they had been dating. He had been charming and fun when things were easy, but the first sign of real responsibility had sent him fleeing back to his fraternity house and his plans for medical school that didn't include supporting a teenage mother. "What do you need?" I had asked, already reaching for my checkbook, despite the fact that my own financial situation as a recent college graduate working an entry-level marketing job wasn't exactly stable enough to support 2 people, let alone 3. "Just help me get through the next few months," Jessica had pleaded, her request seeming reasonable and temporary rather than the beginning of a pattern that would consume my entire adult life. "Once I figure out what I'm doing about school and get back on my feet, I promise I'll pay you back for everything." The promise to pay me back had been delivered with such sincerity that I had genuinely believed Jessica intended to honor it, though looking back I could see that she had already learned to use financial desperation as emotional leverage to extract support from family members who couldn't bear to watch her struggle. The monthly checks I had started sending, $300 that covered her rent in the shared apartment she had moved to after dropping out of college, plus money for groceries, prenatal vitamins, and maternity clothes, had seemed like a manageable sacrifice for someone who was working full-time and living in a studio apartment with minimal expenses. "You're such an amazing sister," Jessica had gushed during our weekly phone calls, her gratitude seeming genuine as she described how much my support was helping her prepare for motherhood while dealing with Marcus's abandonment and our parents' disappointment in her life choices. Our parents had been less supportive than I had expected, treating Jessica's pregnancy as evidence of poor decision-making rather than a family crisis that required collective assistance. Their reaction had reinforced my sense that I was Jessica's primary source of emotional and financial support during a vulnerable time that would hopefully resolve once she gave birth and figured out her long-term plans. "Mom keeps lecturing me about responsibility and consequences," Jessica had complained during one of her calls, her voice mixing hurt and frustration at not receiving the unconditional support she had apparently expected from parents who had already paid for her first year of college and were struggling to understand why their daughter had thrown away educational opportunities for unprotected sex with an unreliable boyfriend. The lectures about responsibility had made me feel even more protective of Jessica, as if my financial support was necessary to counterbalance our parents' harsh judgment of her situation. When little Chloe was born, a beautiful baby girl who immediately captured my heart with her tiny fingers and perfect features, I had been completely committed to ensuring that my niece had everything she needed regardless of the cost to my own financial security. "Look at her, Emma," Jessica had whispered in the hospital room, holding Chloe with the kind of maternal tenderness that had convinced me that this baby was going to transform my sister into a responsible adult who would do whatever was necessary to provide for her daughter's needs. "She's going to have such a good life because she has an aunt who cares enough to help us when we need it most." The help that had started as temporary assistance during a crisis had seamlessly transformed into permanent financial support, as Jessica discovered that single motherhood was expensive and exhausting in ways that she hadn't anticipated when she made the decision to continue her pregnancy. "I tried to get a job, but childcare costs more than I would earn," Jessica had explained when I asked about her plans for becoming financially independent. "It makes more sense for me to stay home with Chloe and focus on being a good mother rather than working just to pay strangers to raise my daughter." The logic had been compelling enough to convince me that continuing my monthly support was actually supporting good parenting choices rather than enabling dependency, especially when I could see how much Jessica loved Chloe and wanted to be present for her daughter's early development. By Chloe's first birthday, I had paid for her crib, high chair, stroller, car seat, and hundreds of dollars in clothes that she outgrew faster than seemed mathematically possible. I had also covered Jessica's rent for 12 months, her grocery bills, her car insurance, and the medical expenses that kept arising despite supposedly comprehensive health coverage. The pattern was established. Jessica would encounter a financial challenge, call me in distress, and I would provide whatever assistance was needed while telling myself that this was temporary support that would end once she got back on her feet. Jessica's transformation from grateful recipient of emergency assistance to entitled beneficiary of my permanent financial servitude had been so gradual that I hadn't recognized it was happening until the expectations had become so entrenched that questioning them was treated as betrayal of family loyalty rather than reasonable boundary setting between adult siblings. "Emma, I need you to send an extra $200 this month," had become Jessica's typical way of opening our phone conversations by the time Chloe turned 2, her tone carrying the casual authority of someone placing an order rather than requesting a favor. "Chloe needs new shoes and winter clothes, and I want to get her some educational toys that are supposed to help with language development." The educational toys that were supposed to help with language development had been the first sign that Jessica was using my financial support not just for basic necessities, but for parenting choices that reflected her aspirations for providing Chloe with advantages rather than just meeting her survival needs. "Those toys are pretty expensive for what they are," I had mentioned carefully, not wanting to seem unsupportive of Chloe's development, but also recognizing that $100 learning systems were luxury items rather than essential purchases for a 2-year-old who was already meeting all her developmental milestones. "Emma, I can't believe you would begrudge your niece the best possible start in life," Jessica had replied, with the kind of wounded disappointment that had become her standard response to any suggestion that my financial support might have reasonable limits. "These toys are investments in her future intelligence and creativity. I thought you cared about Chloe having every advantage." The guilt manipulation had been expertly deployed, transforming my practical question about expensive toys into an attack on my love for my niece and my commitment to her well-being. Rather than argue about toy budgets, I had sent the extra money while telling myself that Jessica's heart was in the right place, even if her execution was becoming increasingly demanding. But the educational toys had been followed by organic food requirements that tripled grocery costs, a premium daycare that promised early childhood enrichment, and music lessons for a 3-year-old who was supposedly showing signs of artistic talent that needed professional nurturing. "All of Chloe's friends at daycare are taking violin lessons," Jessica had explained when requesting funding for yet another expensive enrichment activity. "I don't want her to feel left out or fall behind socially. Music education is really important for brain development, and the teacher says Chloe has natural ability that we shouldn't waste." The natural ability that we shouldn't waste had become Jessica's standard justification for every expensive parenting choice she made. Chloe couldn't wear regular clothes because she was sensitive to synthetic fabrics and needed organic cotton that cost 3 times as much. She couldn't eat normal food because she was developing sophisticated tastes that required organic, locally sourced ingredients. She couldn't play with regular toys because she was intellectually advanced and needed stimulation that only premium educational products could provide. "Jessica seems to have very high standards for Chloe's upbringing," our mother had observed during one of our family dinners, her tone mixing admiration with concern as she listened to Jessica describe Chloe's expensive music lessons, art classes, and language immersion program. "It's wonderful that she's so committed to giving her daughter the best of everything." The best of everything had required increasingly large monthly transfers from my bank account to Jessica's, along with emergency requests for additional funding whenever Chloe needed medical care, outgrew her expensive clothes, or when Jessica decided that some new parenting philosophy required expensive equipment or services. "I've been reading about Montessori education," Jessica had announced during one of our weekly calls, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who had discovered a new way to spend other people's money. "There's a school across town that has the most amazing program, but it's pretty expensive. I think it would be worth the investment for Chloe's cognitive development." The Montessori school had cost more than I had spent on my own college education, but Jessica had presented the tuition as an investment in Chloe's future, rather than an optional expense that might be beyond our family's realistic budget. "Emma, I know it's a lot of money," Jessica had said with the kind of apologetic tone that preceded major financial requests. "But Chloe tested into their gifted program, and the teachers think she has exceptional potential that needs specialized nurturing. I can't live with myself if I hold back her development because of financial limitations." The financial limitations that Jessica referenced were always my financial limitations rather than her own, since she had never treated earning money as her responsibility once she discovered that emotional appeals about Chloe's needs were sufficient to extract whatever funding was required from her sister's paycheck. By the time Chloe started school, Jessica had established a lifestyle that depended entirely on my subsidies while presenting herself to neighbors, other parents, and family members as a devoted single mother who was making sacrifices to give her daughter the best possible upbringing. "Jessica is such an inspiration," I would overhear other mothers saying at Chloe's school events, their voices carrying admiration for someone who appeared to be successfully managing single parenthood while providing her daughter with opportunities that many two-parent families couldn't afford. She really prioritizes Chloe's development over her own comfort. So, the true cost of supporting Jessica's growing family had never been measured just in the thousands of dollars that disappeared from my bank account each month, but in the dreams I had quietly abandoned, the relationships I had sacrificed, and the version of myself that I had slowly erased to make room for my sister's expanding needs and endless financial emergencies. My own apartment had remained a sparse studio in the cheapest neighborhood I could find, that was still safe enough for a single woman, furnished with pieces from thrift stores and garage sales, because every dollar I might have spent on creating a comfortable home for myself was instead going toward Jessica's children's bedroom furniture, educational toys, and organic food requirements that apparently couldn't be compromised for budgetary considerations. "Emma, your place is so minimalist," Jessica had observed during one of her rare visits to my apartment, her tone mixing condescension with concern as she surveyed the card table I used for dining and the air mattress that served as my couch, because I couldn't afford actual furniture while paying for her children's premium lifestyle. The minimalist aesthetic she had commented on was actually poverty disguised as intentional simplicity, though I had been too proud to admit that my sister's financial needs had reduced me to living like a college student well into my 30s, because acknowledging that reality would have required confronting how completely I had prioritized her comfort over my own basic needs. My career had stagnated at the entry level because I couldn't afford the continuing education, professional networking, or wardrobe updates that were necessary for advancement in marketing. While my colleagues attended industry conferences and graduate programs that enhanced their qualifications, I was working overtime shifts to fund Chloe's violin lessons and organic preschool tuition. "Emma, you've been in the same position for 5 years," my supervisor had mentioned during my annual review, her voice carrying the kind of concerned confusion that managers use when discussing employees whose performance is adequate, but whose professional development has mysteriously stalled. "Are you interested in pursuing additional training or certification that might qualify you for promotions?" The additional training that might qualify me for promotions would have required time and money that I didn't have, because my evenings and weekends were devoted to babysitting Jessica's children while she went out with whatever man was currently providing her with romantic companionship and temporary financial assistance. "I'm focusing on work-life balance right now," I had replied with the kind of diplomatic evasion that people use when they can't explain their real circumstances without revealing information that might damage their professional reputation. "I'm not looking to take on additional responsibilities at this time." The work-life balance excuse had become my standard explanation for why I couldn't attend after-work networking events, weekend professional development seminars, or office social gatherings that required spending money I didn't have on clothes, drinks, or restaurant meals that weren't in my severely restricted budget. My social life had withered as friends grew tired of my constant cancellations due to babysitting obligations or my inability to afford activities that normal adults took for granted. Movie tickets, dinner reservations, weekend trips, and holiday celebrations had all become luxuries that I couldn't justify when Jessica's children needed winter coats, school supplies, or medical care that their government insurance didn't fully cover. "Emma, we never see you anymore," my college roommate Sarah had complained during one of our increasingly infrequent phone calls, her voice mixing hurt feelings with genuine concern about my social isolation. "Every time we invite you to something, you either can't afford it or you're babysitting for Jessica. When was the last time you did something just for yourself?" The question about when I had last done something just for myself had been impossible to answer, because I genuinely couldn't remember prioritizing my own desires over my family's financial needs at any point in the previous several years. The romantic relationship that might have led to marriage and children of my own had ended when David finally accepted that I would never be financially or emotionally available for building a life together, while my resources were completely committed to supporting Jessica's reproductive choices. "I love you, Emma, but I can't compete with your sister's children for your attention and financial commitment," David had said during the conversation that ended our 2-year relationship, his voice carrying sadness rather than anger, as he acknowledged that my family obligations made romantic partnership impossible. "You work 2 jobs to pay for their expenses, you spend every weekend babysitting, and you've made it clear that their needs will always come before our relationship." The accusation that I had prioritized Jessica's children over my own romantic happiness had been accurate but painful, especially because David's departure had forced me to acknowledge that I was approaching an age where having children of my own was becoming biologically and practically impossible due to choices I had made about supporting someone else's family. My retirement savings account contained exactly $47, because every contribution I might have made toward my own financial security had been redirected toward immediate needs of children who had been born into circumstances that apparently required my permanent financial sacrifice to remedy. Emma, you need to start thinking about your long-term financial planning, my bank's financial advisor had warned during a meeting about my non-existent savings and investment accounts. At your current rate of savings, you'll need to work until you're 80 just to afford basic retirement expenses. The warning about working until I was 80 had been delivered with professional concern, but hadn't included practical advice about how to balance retirement planning with ongoing family obligations that seemed to increase rather than decrease as Jessica's children grew older and their needs became more expensive. The toxic dynamic between Jessica and me hadn't developed in isolation, but had been carefully cultivated and reinforced by a family system that praised my self-sacrifice as virtue while protecting Jessica from the natural consequences of her financial irresponsibility through my willingness to serve as her perpetual safety net. Emma is such a good sister had become our mother's standard refrain whenever anyone in our extended family observed the obvious disparity between my Spartan lifestyle and Jessica's comfortable circumstances despite her lack of employment or responsible financial planning. She has such a generous heart and really understands what family means. The generous heart that our mother praised so consistently had been shaped by years of family messaging that positioned my willingness to sacrifice for Jessica as evidence of moral superiority rather than dysfunction, while Jessica's endless needs were treated as unfortunate circumstances rather than predictable consequences of poor decision-making. Not everyone is called to be a mother, our father would add, whenever the topic of my unmarried, childless status arose during family gatherings, his voice carrying the kind of religious certainty that transformed my involuntary spinsterhood into a divine calling, rather than the result of having no time or money for dating while supporting someone else's reproductive choices. The divine calling narrative had been particularly useful for family members who might otherwise have questioned why an intelligent, capable woman in her 30s was living like a graduate student while her younger sister enjoyed a lifestyle that most two-parent families couldn't afford without substantial dual incomes. Our grandparents had actively reinforced the dynamic by consistently praising Jessica's mothering skills while treating my financial contributions as natural extensions of aunt duties rather than extraordinary sacrifices that deserved recognition or gratitude. Jessica is raising those children so beautifully, Grandma Helen would observe during holiday visits, her voice carrying admiration for Jessica's parenting choices without acknowledgement that those choices were funded entirely by my overtime wages and foregone personal expenses. They're such well-behaved, bright children. She must be doing something right. The something that Jessica was doing right was spending unlimited amounts of my money on organic food, educational enrichment, and premium childcare, while presenting herself as a naturally gifted mother whose success was due to intuitive parenting skills rather than financial resources that most single mothers didn't have access to. Extended family members had gradually learned not to ask me about my own life plans because my answers were always variations of, "I'm focused on helping Jessica right now," delivered with the kind of resigned cheerfulness that made people uncomfortable enough to change the subject rather than probe deeper into circumstances that everyone could see, but no one wanted to examine closely. "Emma's always been the responsible one," Uncle Mark would say, when comparing his two nieces, his tone suggesting that responsibility was a personality trait, rather than a role that had been assigned to me through family expectations and emotional manipulation. The responsible one designation had excused Jessica from developing any actual responsibility for her choices, while placing unlimited obligation on me to ensure that her poor decisions didn't result in consequences that might affect her children's well-being or the family's reputation. When Jessica's second pregnancy had been announced, another oops with a different man who disappeared as soon as paternity was confirmed, our parents' response had been to express concern about how Emma would handle the additional financial burden, rather than questioning why Jessica kept making reproductive choices that she couldn't afford to support independently. "Emma, you know we'll help however we can," our mother had said during a family meeting about Jessica's expanding needs, her offer of assistance carefully limited to emotional support, rather than the kind of financial commitment she expected from me. "But with Dad's retirement and our fixed income, we can't contribute much more than babysitting and moral support." The moral support had been substantial and unwavering, consistently reinforcing the family narrative that positioned Jessica as a victim of unfortunate circumstances, rather than someone who had made a series of irresponsible decisions that required other people to sacrifice their own financial security to remedy. "Life happens," our father would say whenever anyone questioned Jessica's pattern of unplanned pregnancies with unreliable men, his tone suggesting that reproduction was something that happened to Jessica, rather than something she chose despite having no means to support the resulting children. The "life happens" philosophy had absolved Jessica of any responsibility for birth control, partner selection, or financial planning, while creating unlimited obligation for me to ensure that life happening didn't result in hardship for children who hadn't asked to be born into circumstances that required their aunt's permanent financial sacrifice. By the time Jessica announced her 5th pregnancy, the family had established such a normalized pattern of expecting my support that questioning the arrangement had become unthinkable rather than reasonable, with any suggestion that Jessica should develop financial independence treated as selfishness rather than boundary setting. "Emma knows how important family is," our mother would say to deflect any criticism of the arrangement, her voice carrying the kind of moral certainty that transformed exploitation into virtue and made questioning the dynamic seem like attacking sacred family values rather than addressing obvious dysfunction. The anger had been building for months before the baby shower, accumulating like pressure behind a dam as each new financial demand, each casual assumption of my continued support, and each public acknowledgement of my sacrifices without corresponding recognition of their cost had pushed me closer to an emotional breaking point that I hadn't seen coming until it was too late to prevent. The resentment had started small and manageable, emerging as brief moments of irritation when Jessica called with emergencies that required immediate financial solutions for problems that could have been avoided through basic planning or budgeting. A broken washing machine that needed replacement because she had been putting off maintenance, school registration fees that she had forgotten to save for despite having months of advance notice, medical expenses that weren't actually emergencies, but had been framed as urgent to bypass any discussion of whether they were truly necessary. "Emma, I hate to ask, but Logan's pediatrician says he needs this special testing for his learning difficulties," Jessica had called to announce during one of her increasingly frequent requests for medical funding, her voice carrying the practiced urgency of someone who had learned to present optional expenses as mandatory crises. The special testing that Logan supposedly needed had cost $800 and had resulted in a diagnosis of mild attention difficulties that required expensive tutoring, dietary supplements, and educational accommodations that transformed a normal 6-year-old's occasional distractibility into a medical condition requiring ongoing professional intervention, funded by his aunt's credit cards. "The specialist says early intervention is crucial," Jessica had explained when I questioned whether 3rd-grade tutoring was really necessary for a child who was getting B's in school and seemed perfectly happy with his academic performance. "If we don't address these issues now, Logan could struggle throughout his entire educational career." The early intervention had become another monthly expense added to the growing list of therapeutic services, enrichment programs, and specialized products that Jessica deemed essential for her children's optimal development, each one presented as an investment in their future rather than an optional expense that might be beyond our realistic budget. My breaking point had started the day I realized I was choosing between grocery shopping and paying my electric bill, because Jessica's latest emergency, Chloe's urgent need for a laptop for her middle school projects, had required me to advance next week's paycheck to cover expenses that apparently couldn't wait for my normal monthly contribution. "I know it's a lot of money," Jessica had said while showing me the premium laptop she had already purchased for Chloe, her tone mixing apology with expectation as she explained why a 13-year-old needed a $1,500 computer for school assignments that could have been completed on a basic model, costing a third as much. "Jessica, I literally can't afford this right now," I had said for the first time in our financial relationship, my honesty creating an uncomfortable silence as both of us processed the reality that my resources had finally reached their actual limits, rather than the theoretical limits I had been pushing past for years. "Emma, Chloe can't be the only kid in her class without a decent laptop," Jessica had replied with the kind of social pressure argument that had always been effective in extracting money from my guilt about her children's potential embarrassment or disadvantage. "She's already dealing with being from a single-parent family. I can't let her also be the poor kid with the cheap equipment." The poor kid with the cheap equipment had been exactly what I was becoming while funding Chloe's premium lifestyle, though pointing out this irony had seemed cruel when Jessica was genuinely concerned about her daughter's social standing among classmates whose 2-parent families could afford to buy expensive electronics without compromising their own basic needs. The laptop incident had been followed by an emergency dental bill for Mason's orthodontic work, Sophia's urgent need for soccer equipment and league fees, and Logan's essential summer camp tuition that would provide him with confidence-building experiences that Jessica deemed crucial for his social development. Each request had been presented with emotional urgency that made saying no feel like abandoning children, rather than establishing reasonable boundaries with an adult who had developed no capacity for financial independence despite receiving unlimited support for over a decade. "Emma, I don't know what I would do without you," had become Jessica's standard closing for every conversation about money, delivered with gratitude that felt both genuine and manipulative as she acknowledged my sacrifices, while simultaneously increasing the demands that required those sacrifices. The final straw had been Jessica's casual announcement that she was planning a week-long vacation to Disney World with her current boyfriend, funded by money she had saved by not paying her own rent for 3 months, while I covered her housing expenses under the assumption that she was experiencing temporary financial difficulties. "The kids have never been to Disney," she had explained when I discovered that my emergency rent assistance had actually been subsidizing her vacation planning. "I want to give them magical memories before the new baby comes, and travel becomes more complicated. Magical memories funded by my credit cards, while I hadn't taken a vacation in 6 years, because I couldn't afford to miss work or spend money on anything that didn't directly benefit Jessica's children." Jessica's announcement of her 5th pregnancy had arrived not through a private phone call or family meeting, but through a social media post featuring a carefully staged photograph of 4 tiny hands holding a sonogram image, with the caption, "Our family is getting bigger, baby number 5 due in March," followed by heart emojis and thanking tags to everyone except the person who had been financially supporting the existing 4 children. The public announcement had been my first indication that Jessica was pregnant again, a deliberate choice that transformed what should have been family news into a social media event where my reaction would be performed for an audience of hundreds of friends and relatives who would be watching to see how the devoted aunt responded to news of another niece or nephew to spoil. "Congratulations," I had typed in the comments section, my response as automated and hollow as the dozens of similar messages from people who knew about Jessica's family situation, but had never questioned the financial logistics that made her expanding household possible without any visible means of support. The private phone call had come 3 days later, after Jessica had received sufficient public validation for her pregnancy to feel confident about approaching me for the financial commitments that would make this baby as comfortable and well provided for as her other children. "Emma, I know the timing isn't ideal," Jessica had begun with the apologetic tone she used when requesting money for situations that she had created through her own choices, but expected me to solve through mine. "But Trevor and I are really excited about this baby, and I wanted to talk to you about some practical concerns." Trevor was Jessica's boyfriend of 8 months, a construction worker whose sporadic employment and existing child support obligations for 2 children from previous relationships made him an unlikely candidate for supporting a 5th child, though Jessica seemed optimistic that his romantic feelings for her would translate into financial responsibility for their shared offspring. "What kind of practical concerns?" I had asked, though I already knew that practical concerns was Jessica's euphemism for expenses that she couldn't afford and expected me to cover. "Well, my lease is up next month, and Trevor thinks we should get a bigger place now that we're going to need room for the baby," Jessica had explained, her tone suggesting that upgrading to more expensive housing was a logical response to reduced income rather than evidence of poor financial planning. "The rent will be higher, but it's important that all the kids have adequate space. The adequate space that Jessica deemed important would cost an additional $400 per month in rent, plus moving expenses, security deposits, and new furniture to fill the larger apartment that she couldn't afford but considered necessary for optimal child-rearing. Jessica, how are you planning to pay for a more expensive apartment when you're not working, and Trevor's income is inconsistent?" I had asked with the kind of practical question that always made my sister defensive about her financial decisions. "Trevor's looking for steady work, and I'll probably get a job after the baby comes," Jessica had replied, with the vague optimism she always displayed about future financial plans that never materialized into actual income. "In the meantime, I was hoping you could help with the deposit and maybe contribute a little extra each month until we get established in the new place." A little extra each month had become Jessica's standard phrase for requesting increases in my monthly support, though the extra assistance always seemed to become permanent rather than temporary, as her expenses expanded to match whatever financial resources were available. The bigger apartment had been followed by requests for a new crib, premium baby monitors, organic mattresses, and all the specialized equipment that Jessica deemed necessary for providing her fifth child with the same standard of care as the older children who had been accustomed to receiving only the best products regardless of cost. "I want this baby to have everything the others had," Jessica had explained when I questioned whether a $600 stroller was really necessary for a fifth child when there were perfectly functional alternatives that cost a fraction of the premium price. "It wouldn't be fair to treat this baby differently just because money is tight right now." Money being tight was Jessica's way of describing a situation where I was tight on money while she continued spending unlimited amounts of my income on child-related expenses that seemed to increase exponentially with each pregnancy, rather than decreasing through economies of scale or reused equipment. The pregnancy had also brought renewed pressure from family members, who assumed that I would be even more generous with baby number 5, since my track record with the first 4 children had established me as someone whose financial support could be counted on regardless of my own circumstances. "Emma's going to have her hands full with another baby to help with," our mother had commented during a family dinner, where Jessica's pregnancy was discussed as if it were a community project rather than an individual responsibility that should belong to the parents who had created the situation. The community project mentality had made it impossible to express any concerns about Jessica's financial planning or my own capacity to support another child without seeming selfish or unsupportive of family values that prioritize child welfare over individual boundaries. By the time the baby shower invitations were sent out, printed on expensive cardstock and requesting contributions to Jessica's baby registry featuring premium items that most parents would consider luxury purchases, I had realized that Jessica's 5th pregnancy was being treated as another opportunity for me to demonstrate my unlimited generosity, rather than a situation that might require some financial responsibility from the people who had decided to create another human being. The baby shower that would become the scene of my decade-delayed confrontation with Jessica had been planned with the same casual assumption of my financial and logistical support that characterized every aspect of our family dynamic, though this time the expectations had been communicated through my mother rather than directly from Jessica, adding another layer of family pressure to ensure my compliance. "Emma, sweetheart, Jessica asked me to talk to you about hosting her baby shower," our mother had announced during our weekly phone call, her tone carrying the diplomatic authority of someone delivering news that was supposed to be good but might require negotiation. "She's been feeling overwhelmed with the pregnancy and everything, so she was hoping you could take care of organizing something special for her." Something special had been decoded through years of family experience as an expensive celebration that would demonstrate our family's love and support for Jessica's reproductive choices, while requiring me to sacrifice time and money. I didn't have to create magical memories for someone who had never reciprocated with consideration for my own needs or circumstances. "What kind of shower is she envisioning?" I had asked, though I already knew that Jessica's vision would involve premium venues, professional catering, elaborate decorations, and guest favors that would cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Nothing too fancy," our mother had replied, with the kind of diplomatic understatement that family members use when requesting expensive favors. "Just a nice gathering where Jessica can feel celebrated and supported during this special time. Maybe 30 or 40 people, with refreshments and some games." 30 or 40 people with refreshments and some games translated to a catered event costing several $1,000s when factoring in venue rental, professional food service, decorations that met Jessica's aesthetic standards, and party favors that wouldn't embarrass our family in front of relatives and friends who would be evaluating our celebration against the elaborate showers they had attended for other expectant mothers. "I was thinking we could have it at the community center," I had suggested, hoping to minimize costs through a modest venue that would require basic decorations and simple refreshments, rather than the kind of Pinterest-worthy celebration that Jessica had come to expect for her pregnancy announcements. "Oh, Emma, the community center seems a little casual for such an important occasion," our mother had replied with gentle disappointment, her tone suggesting that proposing a budget-friendly venue was evidence of insufficient appreciation for Jessica's pregnancy, rather than realistic assessment of my financial limitations. The important occasion that required a more impressive venue had ultimately been held at Riverside Gardens, an upscale event space that charged premium rates for baby showers that would be photographed and shared on social media by guests who expected their friends to provide entertainment value proportional to their social status. "Jessica will be so happy that you chose such a beautiful location," our mother had said with satisfaction, after I had confirmed the venue booking that would consume my entire vacation fund and require me to work overtime for the next month to cover the associated expenses. The beautiful location had needed beautiful decorations, which had required hiring a party planning service that specialized in creating Instagram-worthy celebrations, featuring fresh flower arrangements, custom signage, and themed table settings that looked professionally designed rather than assembled by someone's aunt, who had never planned an event more elaborate than a birthday party. "The decorations look absolutely gorgeous," our cousin Michelle had exclaimed while reviewing the party planner's portfolio, her enthusiasm validating the expense while ignoring the financial strain that funding Jessica's aesthetic preferences was placing on the person who would be responsible for all the bills. The gorgeous decorations had been accompanied by catered lunch from Jessica's favorite restaurant, premium beverages including champagne that most of the guests wouldn't drink, but which was considered necessary for proper shower etiquette, and personalized party favors that cost $15 each to produce, but were deemed essential for creating memorable experiences for attendees. "Emma, you've really outdone yourself this time," Jessica had said while reviewing the shower preparations the morning of the event, her appreciation seeming genuine as she surveyed the expensive celebration that would announce her 5th pregnancy with the same fanfare as celebrity baby reveals featured in magazines. The appreciation had felt both validating and hollow, since Jessica's gratitude was always directed toward the end result of my financial sacrifice, rather than acknowledgement of what those sacrifices cost me personally or professionally. The guest list had included extended family members, neighborhood friends, and Jessica's social media connections, who would be documenting the celebration with photographs that would reinforce the public narrative of Jessica as a beloved mother-to-be whose family spared no expense in demonstrating their support for her growing family. "This shower is going to be perfect," our mother had declared, while making final adjustments to the gift table where presents from Jessica's expensive registry would be displayed as evidence of her popularity and the generosity of people who cared about her enough to purchase premium baby products. Perfect had meant costly, time-consuming, and designed to meet Jessica's standards for social media presentation, rather than my budget for family celebrations, creating the elaborate stage where my decade of resentment would finally find its voice. The silence that followed my request to talk extended for what felt like an eternity, 30 women holding their breath as they recognized the shift in energy from celebratory to confrontational, while Jessica's confident smile faltered as she apparently realized that her assumption of my continued financial servitude was about to be challenged in front of an audience that had gathered to witness her triumph. "Emma, I'm sure whatever you want to discuss can wait until after the shower," Jessica had said, with the kind of diplomatic deflection that she used to avoid uncomfortable conversations, her voice carrying nervous laughter as she gestured toward the gifts that still needed to be opened and the cake that hadn't been cut. "Everyone's here to celebrate the baby, and I'd hate to take attention away from that. But I had spent 10 years allowing my attention to be diverted from uncomfortable truths about our family dynamic. And this time the audience that Jessica was trying to protect was exactly what I needed, to finally speak honestly about the financial exploitation that had been disguised as family loyalty for too long. "Actually, Jessica, I think our guests deserve to understand exactly what you mean when you talk about me helping with this baby," I had replied, my voice carrying a strength that surprised me as much as it seemed to startle everyone else in the room, "since you've made my financial support such a public topic of conversation." The public topic of conversation that Jessica had created through years of casual references to my contributions was now going to receive the kind of detailed examination that she had always avoided through emotional manipulation and guilt-based appeals to family obligation. "Everyone here has heard about how generous Emma is," I had continued, looking around the room at faces that were beginning to show uncomfortable recognition of where this conversation was heading, how she's helped with diapers and formula and rent payments. What you might not know is exactly what that help has cost. I had pulled out my phone and opened the financial tracking app, where I had been documenting every dollar transferred to Jessica's various accounts, every emergency payment, every contribution to children's expenses that had been presented as temporary assistance, but had become permanent financial obligation. "In the past 10 years, I have paid Jessica $63,000 in direct financial support," I had announced, watching faces around the room register shock at the specific amount that transformed abstract references to help into concrete evidence of financial sacrifice. "That's $63,000 of my income, from jobs where I work overtime and double shifts while Jessica stays home with children that I'm supporting." The $63,000 didn't include the indirect costs, the vacations I hadn't taken, the retirement contributions I hadn't made, the professional development I couldn't afford, the relationships that had ended because I had no time or money for dating while funding someone else's reproductive choices. "Emma, you're making this sound like I forced you to help," Jessica had protested, her voice rising with defensive panic as she tried to reframe a decade of financial exploitation as voluntary generosity that shouldn't be discussed in terms of costs and consequences. "You didn't force me," I had replied with devastating honesty that cut through years of self-deception and family mythology about my willing sacrifice. You manipulated me. Every time I tried to set boundaries, you used your children as emotional weapons. Every time I suggested you get a job, you claimed it would hurt the kids. Every time I mentioned my own financial struggles, you found a bigger emergency that required immediate attention. The manipulation that I was finally naming had been so consistent and effective that even I had stopped recognizing it as manipulation, accepting instead the family narrative that positioned my financial support as evidence of my generous nature, rather than the result of systematic emotional exploitation. Jessica has never had to learn financial responsibility because I've been her safety net for every poor decision she's made, I had continued, my voice growing stronger as I spoke truths that had been buried under years of family pressure to maintain harmony rather than address dysfunction. 5 children with 4 different men who all disappeared as soon as paternity was confirmed, because Jessica knew that her sister would pay for whatever the fathers wouldn't. The pattern that I was describing was so obvious that everyone in the room could recognize it once it was stated explicitly, though the social discomfort of witnessing family dysfunction being aired publicly was making several guests move toward the exits. And now she's announcing her expectation that I'll fund baby number 5 in front of all of you, because she's learned that public pressure is effective in preventing me from saying no to financial requests that would be outrageous if they came from anyone else. Jessica's face had gone white as she realized that her strategy of using social pressure to ensure my continued support had backfired catastrophically, creating the perfect audience for my decade-delayed confrontation with her sense of entitlement to my financial resources. I'm 34 years old, I had concluded, looking directly at Jessica as tears began streaming down my face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief at finally speaking the truth about our relationship. I have no savings, no retirement fund, no husband, no children of my own, and no life outside of working to support your choices. I'm done, Jessica. I'm done pretending this is normal or healthy or sustainable. The room was completely silent as Jessica stared at me with an expression of shock that suggested she had genuinely never considered the possibility that her financial support system might someday refuse to continue enabling her lifestyle. The aftermath of my confrontation at the baby shower had unfolded over the following weeks, with the kind of dramatic intensity that accompanies the collapse of long-established family systems, as Jessica and our parents struggled to adjust to the reality that I would no longer be available as an unlimited source of financial support and emotional labor. The immediate response had been a campaign of guilt and manipulation, designed to restore the previous dynamic through emotional pressure, rather than addressing the underlying problems that had created the crisis in the first place. "Emma, I can't believe you would abandon your family when we need you most," our mother had said during the first of many phone calls, attempting to convince me that establishing boundaries with Jessica was a selfish betrayal of family values, rather than a necessary step toward healthy relationships. The abandonment narrative had been particularly ironic, given that I had been the only family member providing consistent support to Jessica's children for over a decade, while everyone else contributed primarily criticism and advice about how I should continue sacrificing my own well-being for the benefit of people who had never reciprocated with consideration for my needs. "I'm not abandoning anyone," I had replied, with the kind of calm certainty that comes from finally understanding your own worth and refusing to accept other people's definitions of your obligations. "I'm establishing reasonable boundaries between helping family members and enabling destructive behavior." The boundaries that I was establishing included an end to monthly financial transfers, emergency funding for non-emergencies, and automatic assumption that I would provide childcare, transportation, or other services without being asked and without any consideration of my own schedule or needs. "Jessica is pregnant and vulnerable," our father had argued during his attempt to convince me to restore financial support before the baby arrived, his voice carrying the kind of protective concern that had never been directed toward my vulnerability during years of financial exploitation. "This isn't the time to make drastic changes that could affect the baby's well-being." The baby's well-being had become the family's primary argument for maintaining the status quo, though none of them seemed willing to address the obvious question of why Jessica had chosen to become pregnant again, if she couldn't afford to support another child without depending on her sister's unlimited financial sacrifice. If Jessica is concerned about the baby's well-being, she should consider getting a job or asking Trevor to contribute to expenses, rather than expecting me to fund another child that I didn't choose to create. I had replied with practical logic that apparently seemed harsh to family members who had become accustomed to my automatic compliance with their expectations. Jessica herself had alternated between rage and desperate pleading as she realized that her comfortable lifestyle was genuinely threatened by my refusal to continue providing the financial foundation that had supported her family for years. "Emma, you're going to destroy my children's lives because you're having some kind of midlife crisis," Jessica had sobbed during one of her many calls attempting to restore our financial relationship through emotional manipulation. "They're going to lose their home, their school, everything stable in their lives because their aunt decided to be selfish." The midlife crisis accusation had been Jessica's attempt to pathologize my decision to prioritize my own financial security over her comfort. Though at 34, I was arguably having the opposite of a midlife crisis. I was finally starting the adult life that had been delayed for a decade by family obligations. The practical consequences of my new boundaries had forced Jessica to confront realities that she had been avoiding through my financial support. Without my rent contributions, she had been required to move to a smaller, less expensive apartment. Without my childcare services, she had been forced to arrange alternative supervision for her children. Without my emergency funding, she had been required to budget and plan for expenses, rather than assuming that financial crises could be solved through phone calls to her sister. Jessica got a part-time job at the retail store in the mall, our mother had reported during one of our awkward monthly check-ins, her tone mixing pride with concern as she described Jessica's first employment in over a decade. "It's not much money, but it's a start toward becoming more independent." The independence that Jessica was slowly developing had been accompanied by Trevor's increased involvement in household expenses, though his contributions were sporadic and insufficient to maintain the lifestyle that Jessica had enjoyed while receiving my support. But the most significant change had been in my own life, as the money and time that had previously been devoted to Jessica's needs became available for pursuing goals and relationships that had been deferred for too long. "Emma, you seem so much happier lately," my friend Sarah had observed during one of our renewed regular dinners, her voice carrying surprise at seeing me engaged in social activities that didn't revolve around babysitting or family crisis management. "You have this energy that I haven't seen in years." The energy that Sarah was noticing had come from finally living for myself, rather than existing as a support system for other people's choices, pursuing professional development that had improved my job prospects, and beginning to explore romantic relationships that weren't sabotaged by unlimited family obligations. 6 months after the baby shower confrontation, I had received a promotion at work, started contributing to a retirement account, and begun planning a vacation that would be funded by money I earned, rather than money left over, after supporting someone else's lifestyle. Jessica had given birth to a healthy baby girl, who would grow up understanding that family members support each other without losing themselves in the process.